Hello together. So my today's presentation is about the Fiat Lie and why hard money is the better choice. And yeah, I am Roman Reher, the founder and CEO of Blocktrainer. It's the largest German-speaking Bitcoin YouTube channel with more than 215,000 subscribers. And I have an amazing team behind my work, which are producing articles and writing about news about the Bitcoin space, but even about economic and other important things which are affected by Bitcoin or to Bitcoin. So our website has more than 500,000 page views per month, and I started this channel back in 2018 as a hobby, and it became a small Bitcoin media company. But yeah, in fact, in Germany, one of the largest, or no, the largest channel by far. And yeah, since my native language is German, and today's presentation is quite complex, and we have some important data, I probably need my cards here sometimes to read from this, so sorry for that. But I think it's very interesting, and it's very important to be correct here with the data. So when it comes to the monetary system, the fiat maximalists, mainstream economists, politicians, and mainstream media outlets try to convince us that a central managed monetary system with a moderate inflation is good for all of us. So if we ask them why, they try to tell us no one will keep prices stable without this, and in the end, when the economy needs to be stimulated, no one can do this without inflation. So they try to convince us that we need expanding money supply for economic growth, and that deflation, which means falling prices, would make us poor in the end. So when the price is falling, we lose our jobs and so on, and we end up in nothing. So, and that's pretty weird. Bitcoiners know that. Bitcoiners know that's mostly propaganda, and they just want to make us believe that this is a necessary process, the so-called tax inflation, for a functioning society. But in fact, it will make the state and his close associates richer and richer through the Cantillon effect. So when we debate this topic, our opponents, the fiat maximalists, often entangled in specific details to prove their points. So they try to discuss these details, and this is hard for us to have good points against this. And this is the reason why I do my presentation here today. For example, the main argument why deflation and hard money standards are bad is the Great Depression back in the 1920s. So in fact, we saw this worldwide huge economic crisis, and we saw falling prices, and we saw rising poverty rates, and we saw that the economy collapses at the end. But if you take a closer look on the data, you see that the main cause was the excessive credit expansion before. In the time before, they created 62% new banknotes and new money. So in the end, the boom phase of the money supply increasement was the reason for this economic decline in the end. To argue like this, you need to be very informed about the data to respect specific events. So you need to explain that deflation can be a side effect of a bust of an unsustainable boom, which occurred in the first place because of money creation and artificially low interest rates. You need to know that that if you observe deflationary periods in the past, there isn't a statistically significant link between falling prices and economic decline. So an interesting paper here from the Bank for International Settlement looked at 38 countries over 140 years, and they made a very interesting conclusion. Let me read about this conclusion here. Let me quote this. The evidence from our long historical data set sheds new light on the cost of deflation. It raises questions about the prevailing view that goods and services price deflation, even if persistent, are always pernicious. It is misleading to draw interferences about the cost of deflation from the Great Depression as if it was the archetypal example. So that means there's no evident data that deflation follows into an economic decline, especially if you look at the Great Depression as the one and only thing about this, where all the mainstream economists point at. Even this was not a real deflation because of the massive money increasement before. A deflation can be a side effect of the bust of an unsustainable bubble. Austrian economics explained this 100 years ago with their Austrian business cycle theory. And an analogy of drug addiction applies when it comes to the topic of deflation and economic collapse. Drug abstinence is very painful, and this also may kill you in the end. But we all know that it's better to become clean instead of staying addicted. So even if it's a painful process, you should try to become clean. The Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises wrote in his book Human Action many decades ago, ignorance manifests itself also in the confusion of deflation and contraction and of the process of readjustment into which every expansionist boom must lead. And he also wrote, as soon as the depression appears, there's a general lament over deflation and people clamor for continuation of the expansionist policy. So that means they continue printing money in situations when this effect, this printing of more banknotes makes problems. So they fight fire with fire. In this presentation, I want to show you some more historical evidence to prove the point that hard money, which cannot be controlled by the state, is better for all of us, except for sure for the profiteers of the Cantillon effect. And the good thing on this is that there were a lot of hard money standards in the past, and we can compare this to the fiat standards in the last years, or in the fiat standards we had as in our human history. One thing in the US example, there have been different monetary systems. Before the creation of the Federal Reserve in the 1913, there was more or less a market-based gold standard. And you can see a paper here from Thomas L. Hogan. He's a well-known economist and formerly chief economist from the US Senate Committee for Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs. And he published this very interesting paper in 2021, which is called How Good Was the Gold Standard? In this academic paper, you see some interesting points like this here. He compared the different monetary regimes in the US in respect to economic growth and inflation. You can see here the market-based gold standard, and you see a very low inflation rate. For sure, even gold has a little inflation, but you see it was very stable over more than 100 years. And when it comes to a managed gold standard by the Federal Reserve, this inflation was going up. In the end, you see the fiat standard, and the inflation rate was very high. The price level was going up more and more. To have specific numbers on this, you can see in the following some periods, period numbers and the inflation rate, like this one here from the market-based gold standard, 0.2% inflation from 1790 to 1913. And when you compare this with the third one here, with the Fed managed gold standard, you see even the Bretton Woods system had an inflation in average from 2.7%, so 2.5% more than the market-based gold standard. And really crazy is the last one here, the Federal Reserve managed fiat standard. Since the Nixon shock in August 1971, you have an average inflation of 4%. And remember, the target of central banks for inflation is 2%, so it's double that high. What's also crazy here is that you can see it's to 2019. So they're missing the data from the whole COVID pandemic in the recent years, where they created 1/3 of all dollars which ever have been created. So I think the average inflation rate should be way higher if we look at current data. Yeah, and if we ask mainstream economists, they say we need inflation for economic growth. We should see that the economic growth in these phases with high inflation should be better, right? And it should be a disaster if we see the market-based standard. So the next graph shows you the GDP growth rate, inflation adjusted, and you see that the market-based gold standard had an average GDP growth rate from 4.2%, and compared to the Fed-managed fiat standard, it's only 2.8%. So that means, yeah, we have economic growth, but it's very, very slow, and especially compared to the market-based gold standard, it's very inefficient in the end. And we have to ask ourselves, this is the argument for central banks, so what's their evident data for their own job? And if you compare this directly, the numbers just looking crazy, and you can see that since the Fed was founded in 1913, the economic growth rate went down. So in this paper here, Thomas L. Hogan made another statement. I want to quote this. I find that the Fed has not obviously outperformed the market-based gold standard. The price level was more predictable prior to the creation of the Fed, and the rate of inflation was lower. Real GDP growth was higher on the market-based gold standard, while the volatility of real GDP growth has been marginally lower under the post-war Fed. Financial markets were volatile prior to the creation of the Fed, but they have been more volatile in the time since. So he says, okay, a little bit volatility is also there, but the Federal Reserve says they stabilize the prices, but they fail with this, more than a not regulated money system like the market-based gold standard. Even if we take a closer look at the central bank managed gold standard of the Bretton Woods system, it was way better than the current fiat standard. You can compare here these two time frames. In Germany and Austria, we use the term Wirtschaftswunder. It describes a period of economic prosperity. The term means something like economic wonder in English. And in the US, you call this period the post-World War prosperity. And if you compare, and if you look at this chart here, you see this is from the Federal Reserve St. Louis chart, and you see the Bretton Woods system started in 1971. This is a red line on the left side here. And from the beginning of the central bank, you can see how the real GDP and the real GDP per capita went down over the time. And yeah, we are literally going straight to zero. Let me ask, in this case, what the fuck happened in 1971? Another argument from the fiat maximalist is that we, without endless money creation, have no more inventions. So all the great things people invent couldn't be invented without the lack of money or credit. But in fact, the Industrial Revolution, I mean, mankind's greatest progress started around the second half of the 18th century. And what's interestingly here, Great Britain was the first country on a gold standard during the time, so de facto on since 1717. And you can see here on this graph, more or less, Great Britain had over hundreds of years a stagnation of economy growth. And since they're on the gold standard, this line here is going through the roof. It's the blue line, the top blue line. Yeah, and when the money regime of the gold standard became the widespread monetary system in the end of the 19th century worldwide, you see that the second industrial revolution in the US and the Belle Epoque in the EU are coming up. Belle Epoque is called, like, I don't know, beautiful period in English. And you can compare this. Both epochs are very close to each other. And these are the epochs where we had the second industrial revolution, the so-called technically revolution. Yeah, regarding inventions, this one is interesting here as well, because hard system money seems to be the best. The Ohio State University made a list in the year 2000. On this list, they tried to find the 10 most or biggest inventions of human history or of human history of the past 1,000 years. And you see in red marked, these are the time of the classic gold standard. So most of the biggest inventions of the past 1,000 years are coming directly from the gold standard. Interesting is the computer here, 1939, because this was close after the gold standard in the Bretton Woods System. So if you look at all these inventions here, especially the electric light, the telephone, the automobile, the radio, and so on, you realize this is where our global internet is coming from, where our basis or the base for KI and even Bitcoin is coming from. So we have today huge wealth in our society because of the gold standard and the inventions from this time frame. So to conclude, I think it's hard to compare a Bitcoin standard with a gold standard because these are different systems, right? We can see a harder money would be better for the economy and so better for all of us. We would have more inventions and prices will going down. Life will becoming easier for all of us in the end. The gold standard was a good one for the past, but in a globalized digital world, gold can't hold up. So people are forced to store gold in banks and forced to use certificates to trade and to pay for things. So going back to the gold standard is not that good, but when we look at the function, Bitcoin is a superior asset because you can use Bitcoin itself to pay for things or something like that, even if we do this on layers on top of the main layer of Bitcoin. And I think there's some more interesting points. When we realize there was a free banking era before the 1913 when the Federal Reserve was founded, banks giving out certificates on gold. So this was something like, we know from the Bretton Woods system, but it was very different to the Bretton Woods system because when a bank was giving out more gold certificates and it comes to a bank run, this bank went bankrupt. So the bank fails, the certificates has no more worth from this bank, and there was no more inflation. And so the system regulated by itself, and I think this would be maybe very close to a Bitcoin standard. Since 1913, since the Federal Reserve is doing their jobs, they go to give money to these banks which should go bankrupt, so they do not. And this leads in high inflation and all these problems we know inflation is giving to our society. So I think therefore it was always easy for the government to suspend the convertibility from gold, to print money, to fund endless wars, and to be financed via the so-called inflation tax, right? And I think that Bitcoin is a perfect tool to make wars unaffordable, to shrink governments, and to let the world prosper once and for all. Thank you.
Secure your BTC Prague 2026 ticket at the lowest possible price now.